Okay. Right, let's get started with the introductions to the presentation, as there's a few things that we need to go through before the presentation starts, and then hopefully by the time we actually start the presentation, the others that will hopefully be joining us will have time to dial in as well. So first of all, welcome to everyone on the call for joining this presentation that's been organised by the CIWEM Southwestern Branch. My name is Joanna Goodwin, and I'm the Vice Chair for the Southwestern Branch Committee. In a nutshell, I won't go into too much detail because I don't know much about this topic personally, but tonight's talk is around how we can better balance the supply and demand of low carbon energy with a focus on an approach that has been trialled in Cornwall. We're fortunate to be joined by Dan Nichols, who's the project manager for the development of the local energy market with Centrica. I'm sure he'll tell us more about himself in a moment. The presentation will last approximately 30 to 45 minutes or so, with plenty of time for questions afterwards. And then we'll wrap everything up by 7 o'clock tonight. So you'll be free to go after that. We have a few housekeeping points that I just need to run through. The first is that the webinar event will be recorded. And so please do keep yourselves on mute throughout the presentation, and including the Q&A session at the end. So if you do have questions or comments on the presentation, then we are going to keep all of these till the end. But what we'd like you to do is if you could put your question or comment in the Q&A facility at the bottom of Zoom, and we'll go through as many of these as we can at the end of the presentation. So I'll read through them and hopefully Dan will be able to answer as many as he can. If you experience any technical issues or you need assistance with anything, then use the chat feature on Zoom and let us know. And we've got a couple of CIWEM HQ people that are on hand to try and help you through those if you experience problems. But please just remember the Q&A facility is for questions and comments about the presentation, and the chat box is really just for technical issues. The event will count as an hour and a half of CPD time. However, CIWEM don't provide CPD certificates, so we often get asked that question. Before we start, I'd like to quickly just draw your attention to a couple of other events that CIWEM are organising. So events that are coming up in the very near future. We've got a couple of events that are part of the Flood and Coast Virtual Conference that's ongoing at the moment. On the 3rd of February, we have session 3, which is a new era of digital innovation in flood and coastal erosion risk management. And then as part of the series, we also have an event on the 14th of April, which is broadening innovation investment in flood and coastal erosion risk management. Both of those are £25 plus VAT, but still a lot cheaper than it would have been to actually attend the conference in person. And so I think you'll agree that there's still very, very good value for money. And then we also have a free event on Monday, the 22nd of February, which is adaptation reporting best practice. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure what the topic includes, but it's part of CIWEM's climate emergency adaptation series. So please do look out for those. Barbara, who's part of CIWEM HQ, is going to put the links to some of these events in the chat box. So if you'd like to find out more, then follow those links and it will take you to the events page. Also, do keep an eye out on the central CIWEM events page, as that's where all of the CIWEM events are uploaded with details of how to register for them. And as always, we are constantly on the lookout for presentations, particularly things that are happening in the Southwest region for my branch's own interest. And so please don't hesitate to get in touch if you do have any recommendations for future presentations. So I think that's it as far as the general instructions go. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dan Nichols, who will tell you all about what he does. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Many thanks for having me. And yeah, hopefully the topic that I'll cover today will be informative and interesting. But first, before I start, just a word perhaps about myself and why I'm doing what I'm doing and where I come from. So as Joe mentioned, this project is based down in Cornwall. I originally came from Cornwall, so have long had a vested interest in the kind of future of the area. And before working with Centrica, I had a number of roles in the public sector, including land use planning and sustainable infrastructure work, as well as things like economic development. So I'm very much interested in the broader sustainability agenda, the climate emergency agenda, and of course the wider environment. And I joined Centrica just under 4 years ago to take on this program because I felt that this research and development trial was a really interesting opportunity to help shape the transition of the energy system from one which, obviously, as we know, is still quite heavily dependent on fossil fuels into one which is, clean and call now net zero, and also a system which involves the consumer a lot more than the system does today and has done historically. So I hope you find it interesting. I hope you find it cuts across into areas of your own work, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have at the end of the session. So before I dive into the project I'm doing in Cornwall and explain how that works, I just wanted to spend a couple of moments explaining who I work for and what they do, and indeed why they're involved in this project. So the company is Centrica. Many of you may have heard of the business. It's a multinational energy services company, but perhaps most well known in the UK for owning the British gas supply business. But energy supply is only a part of the business. It's involved in supplying services for businesses. It also has an interest in what we call upstream, which is really the exploration and generation of energy. And in Centrica's case, that's oil, gas, and nuclear. But the business has stated that it's moving away from those three areas to focus much more on what we call energy solutions for customers, and also on the decarbonisation agenda. And I think that's a macro trend in the energy sector. Seeing other businesses also trying to re-strategize and reposition themselves so that they can facilitate this transition that we need to achieve to decarbonize our society. And Centrica very much is in the mix of the businesses that are trying to find its pathway forward and really drive down emissions and put consumers right at the heart of that strategy. So that's Centrica, and this is really summarizing the reason why Centrica and why I have been working on a project in Cornwall, and what that project is trying to achieve. I alluded really to that kind of existential threat of climate change and the need to take action, and the growing consensus around action over the last couple of years in particular. And very simply put, the challenge here is to move away from a reliance on fossil fuel driven power stations like coal and gas power and oil towards a dependence on clean renewable energy sources. But what that means in reality is that the way the system works is going to have to change, and importantly, we're going to have to deal with the challenge around what we do when the resource isn't available at our fingertips. Historically, with coal power stations and gas power stations, you can turn them up, turn them down, turn them off, more or less to meet demand. But you can't do that with renewable energy. Simply put, if the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, you don't have electricity, and you can't store electricity for long periods of time. So that's a challenge when you're trying to balance what's produced with what's used, which is an important principle of managing the energy system. So we now have this increasing challenge of a diminishing set of tools that allows us to manage the network, a desire to increasingly rely on renewable resources, and the need to come up with something that allows our system to continue to decarbonize whilst matching and balancing generation with demand based around renewables, which are only available when the resources are available. And the key to this is the concept of energy flexibility. And that's quite an intangible concept, but when you look at it in terms of the next slide, I hope that that concept starts to come to life. So essentially, energy flexibility is the ability to change when you produce or when you use energy. And this slide summarizes some of the technologies that we now have and we're seeing emerge very rapidly in the UK and indeed across the world, that give us some of these tools to be more flexible with when we use and when we produce our energy. And the top left image, as I look at the screen, is a battery, big battery system. Ultimately, that is a recent development which allows us for a short period of time to store electricity. Of course, the image of the electric car gives us a mini version of a battery. Ultimately, the car connects to the network, pulls power from the network, stores it in a battery, and then discharges that. That gives us another form of flexibility. And of course, we're seeing increasingly the idea of homes becoming smarter with the ability to change when we perhaps put our washing machine on, or the temperature at which our heaters are operating. And of course, the introduction of things like household batteries that give us that ability to flexibly use our energy. And so we're starting to see these technologies emerge. And a few years ago, there was a realization that we could use these technologies as the tech itself improves and as the ability to harness those technologies improves, to help balance the generation of renewable energy with the times in which we need to use that energy. And about 3 or 4 years ago, my colleagues and I sat down and we thought to ourselves, how can we do that? How can we create a tool that allows us to do this more readily and more efficiently? And we came up with the idea that effectively, what if we could build something akin to an eBay platform for trading energy flexibility? And if we could do that, could we create enough uptake that ultimately we give our energy system the tools that it needs to improve the way in which our system is balanced, and do that on a day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute basis. And so we took that concept and we came up with the idea of the Cornwall Local Energy Market. And over the last 3 or 4 years, we've scratched our heads. We've talked to the regulator, we've talked to different parties and stakeholders within the energy industry, and we've come up with this platform, which I liken to eBay, but is effectively a trading platform that allows those that run the network, and in our case, that is the national electricity system and the distribution network operator, which in Cornwall and the southwest region is Western Power Distribution. It allows those parties to join the platform and identify when it sees an imbalance issue, when either it's got too much renewables and we can't use it, or it's not got enough and we can't supply the demand that we need, and go to the market platform and say, can anybody help us with a flexibility service in those timeframes? And then the platform also allows sellers, what we call sellers, but effectively sellers are a range of different businesses, homes, and technologies that can provide a flexibility service. So going back to the previous slide, it could be a smart home, it could be a business with a battery, it could be an electric car, to ultimately declare on the platform when it's got some spare capacity, and then to allow the platform to match that capacity with the needs of the system and effectively enable those sellers to make some extra money from using that flexibility to support the network. And so we built that platform, and we also wanted to make sure we could trial it, we could show how it worked and show that it worked ultimately. And so in Cornwall, alongside the software development piece, we also spent the last 3 years talking to different businesses and talking to households about getting an ecosystem built that allowed us to demonstrate the platform, demonstrate the marketplace. And so we've worked with in excess of 100 businesses, and we've installed a number of different pieces of equipment in those businesses, ranging from energy monitoring equipment connected to devices in a small business, which gives the business a very clear picture of its energy use and allows it to identify when it has flexibility, but also when it has when it's using energy that it doesn't need to. So it allows that business ultimately to save money as well. And we also worked with a smaller number of large businesses to install some large pieces of equipment to allow us to really trial the platform, including a couple of very large batteries, a wind turbine, a solar farm, and what we call combined heat and power, which is a generating plant that produces electricity as well as heat, and ultimately has additional controllability that will provide a flexibility service. So we built a business ecosystem, and we also put a call out about 3 years ago to households in Cornwall to see who would like to get involved in trialing a domestic residential ecosystem to trade flexibility. And we got in excess of 300 households come forward expressing interest, and boiled that down to about 100 homes. And in those homes, we installed a battery and installed solar panels on the roofs, so that each home had its own generation, and it also had an ability to control that generation through the battery to provide flexibility, but at the same time also increase the self-sufficiency and sustainability of those homes. And we aggregated those homes together to enable those homes to trade as a block ultimately. And we really wanted to test that concept as well as part of our platform, because there's two schools of thought around the role that homes might play in a low carbon environment. And that could be that a household might, for example, through their smartphone, decide when they want to make available their flexibility to the market, or they might prefer not to do that. They might prefer to ultimately maximize their own energy in the home, and if they have any spare capacity, ask someone else to sell that for them. And that role in the industry, in the energy industry, is performed by what we call an aggregator, and that effectively is a third-party business that pulls together lots of small assets and creates a portfolio which it then goes and trades. So we wanted to simulate that option, because we think ultimately the majority of people would prefer to maximize their self-sufficiency, but not get involved on a daily basis in trying to identify when they can trade their capacity. So we created an aggregator, and we lumped together those homes, and we traded the availability from all of those batteries in those homes onto the LEM as part of our trial. And the trials are now complete. I'll talk some more about that in a moment, but just to say that we managed to trade in excess of 380 bids. That's different occasions when businesses declare their availability and the network called for that. And from that process, we dispatched, which is an energy term for ultimately turning on a generator or turning down energy load. We dispatched 300 megawatts to the network. So that was 300 megawatts of electricity flexibility that the network effectively bought to help improve the balance of energy supply and demand in Cornwall. And then we spent much of the last year working away, writing reports, distilling our analysis, and coming up with findings about how this tool works and whether it really helps us decarbonize or not, and also what needs to change in the energy system to really to proliferate and grow this tool or similar tools across the UK energy system and beyond. And so we produce a series of reports, And I believe Barbara has a link that she could share with you all on the Q&A or on the chat link. So at your leisure, you can go and explore those documents if you're interested in digging further into that. Just to say, we also, in addition to some of the kind of policy and regs findings and some of the technical findings, we also focused on the behavioral side. So what motivates people to get involved in a market like this? What motivates businesses to want to trade flexibility, perhaps when they've never done it before and they're focused on other things, and what the barriers are to making that happen. All of that information is covered within our findings and our report. So, and you would be very welcome to dig into that at your leisure. But just to dig a little deeper myself, I just thought I'd share a little bit of insight from the different participants in our trials, and hopefully in doing so bring to life what this concept of an energy market trading platform is, and how it affects different businesses, and how it might make people think differently going forward. So before I do that, I just unfortunately I can't give you a live demonstration, partially because I don't trust the technology to allow me to stream a demonstration of a platform across a Zoom platform. But hopefully as time goes by, we'll get more confident in doing that. But ultimately, this is a snapshot, a screenshot of the platform in operation, and this is the view that the buyer has. So this would be your network operator, and in Cornwall that would be Western Power Distribution. So, and they can see from this screenshot that they can look across their whole network and see where there are constraints. So where there's an imbalance between generation and demand. In some cases, that's too much generation. And in Cornwall in particular, there's a particular challenge around too much solar PV generation during the day in the summer, and not enough demand to use that generation. So they might see this picture from their buyer view, and they can then go into different areas of their network, and they can then call on the market for a flexibility service. So if I appreciate you can't see the detail, but if you were to look at some of the white B's in red circles, they show you that at a certain point on the network there is an issue of a constraint or limited headroom available on that network. So Western Power might go onto the platform and say, at 3 Milestone, we might want some flexibility to help manage that issue at a certain point during the day. And they can place those bids. And in 3 Milestone, if, for example, I owned a business, I own maybe a large bakery with, I can change my shift pattern to change the amount of electricity I need, or I decided I'd install a battery on my site so that I've got some flexibility. I can then also declare my availabilities. I could say perhaps I can help Western Power with that problem at a given time of day, and the platform will link those two together and create a contract that will allow me to get paid to help manage the network. So that's just a brief snapshot of what the platform looks like, and a summary of our trials. I've covered some of this already, but just perhaps to draw again, to try and explain the concept of flexibility and how that works, to draw your attention to the mini graph at the bottom of the slide. What that shows is the result of a flexibility service that's been provided. And you can see that if we use my analogy of a bakery with a battery, for example, you can see this is a graph showing that between 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the evening, my bakery has provided an increase in demand to help manage the network. And you see the red line shows my baseline, and my baseline is what I would normally be doing on a 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock evening pattern, shift pattern. And the blue line shows what I then did once I won my contract to provide flexibility. And that might mean that I imported from my battery, so I turned up the import on my battery, or perhaps I increased the process that I was running at that time of day, or brought on an extra shift patterns to focus my energies on producing, let's say, Cornish pasties, to use a good analogy for Cornwall, at that time, more than I would normally do. And the green shows my bid to the platform, the blue shows my delivery, and ultimately that shows that successfully I did manage to provide a service to help manage the network. And in this case, that is site demand increase to help make use of available renewable energy generation and increase the balance of supply and demand in that particular time frame on the network. So as I said, just to bring some color to the trials, the platform, and what this looks like from a business perspective. Let me just drop back a slide. There we are. So this is the Newlyn Ice Factory. I don't know if anybody lives down in West Cornwall and is familiar with this, but down near Penzance, Newlyn Harbour is one of the largest fishing ports in the UK, and the fishing fleet own what is a cooperative which runs an ice factory, and the ice factory produces ice for the whole fleet. And as you can imagine, it produces an awful lot of ice and needs to do so when the fishermen need it, which is when the weather and the tide and the requirements of their fleet need to get out and fish. So it's quite difficult for the ice factory to meet that demand, and there's an extremely large demand for electricity at certain points to service that factory. And effectively, I say it's a factory. There's a picture of it in the top left corner. It's just a very large freezer, but it's so large that it produces 140 tons of ice per day, and it costs up to £20,000 worth in electricity bills per month. So you can imagine this is an ideal business to be able to trade flexibility if there's an opportunity to do so. Because ultimately, as you know, with a freezer, you don't have to run it at the same power consumption all the time. And you could, for example, run it a little sooner than you need the ice and store the ice in the freezer because it won't melt in the short term. Or you could, conversely, you could turn up and produce energy almost when you need it, provided you can time that around the requirements of the fishing fleet. So we spoke to the owner, and this happens to be a one-man band operation. There's a guy that comes into work every day. He works in a small shed beneath that freezer, and he went online, connected to our platform, and he works out, looking at the tide and the needs of the fishing fleet, when he might produce electricity and when he can do so at a way that benefits the network. And in trading that capability, he reckons he saved between 30 and 35% of his monthly energy costs. So for him, somebody who'd never entertained the idea of trading electricity, and ultimately a small business that largely works from hand to mouth to serve the fishing fleet, this is a real new opportunity for it to help increase the wider ambitions of the region for sustainability, but also to really increase its own financial operating sustainability as well. And so the next slide just gives you an overview of some of the other businesses that we worked with and some of the kind of KPIs that we achieved within the trials. And you can see that includes renewable energy generation. The two pictures in the middle of the slide are batteries, and then it shows you really some of the businesses we worked with, most of which had never traded energy or flexibility before, but saw this as an opportunity to perhaps do things differently and save some money and maybe even earn some money over the longer term. And of course, you can imagine that's led to quite a fun summer for our team, going around speaking to those businesses and trying some of the wares and talking to them about how we might do things differently going forward in a more sustainable setup. And just the top of the slide gives you an idea of some of the numbers, really, just to give you a feel, the wind turbine at 2.3 megawatts, I believe that's something like the equivalent power of about 1,500 homes. So some large scale assets used that really help to try and decarbonize the region. And really just to also comment that to date, renewable energy ultimately has been generating in a fairly passive way. We install the assets, they produce power when the resource is available. But on our trial, we also trialed some new flexibility services linked to renewables as well, which, although is quite technical as a concept, it shows that we can, with smart systems, with platforms like our local energy market platform, we can do more and make more use out of our renewable energy resources, as well as give businesses and homes an opportunity to help balance our system in a more proactive way. Just onto the homes. So I said that we had 100 homes participating in the trial. This gives a bit of a flavour for what that meant for those homes. So as I said, each home gets got a battery installed and PV panels installed. And once the trial's completed, they were able to take those assets away, keep them free of charge. So there was an obvious benefit for those homes getting involved in the trial. But also we were able to map the financial savings they achieved during the trial. And of course, the savings achieved simply by installing the equipment in their homes. And you can see that, again, in the numbers, we managed to install 185 kilowatts of solar PV, so a good amount of renewables, again, similar with batteries, and saved nearly 1,000 tons of CO2 per year. So not only did these households manage to save some money off their energy bills, they also made a meaningful contribution to the wider environmental objectives of the project. And as part of the trial, we also gave each household access to an app which allowed them to monitor the performance of their battery and the performance of their solar panels, so they could really understand how it was affecting their energy consumption in their homes, and also how it was contributing to the wider agenda of decarbonisation. And I think what this sort of shows is that increasingly the use of data and technology will change our relationship with energy. And some people will want to be more involved, and others will be more interested in achieving those goals in a slightly more passive way. So bit of a whistle-stop tour of the project itself. There's plenty more you can look into if you're interested, and this is probably the starting point. The link that Barbara shared on the chat will take you to this report, and this is and I've also included a link on the slide which is a direct link to that report. And this report, entitled "The Future of Flexibility," really is a summary of the programme, including some case studies, some of which I've highlighted. It shows what we did, why we did it, and it also talks about what it means for the future of the energy system, how the government and how the regulator can help shape the market to really make the most of these opportunities and ultimately increase the pace at which we decarbonise the energy system. And just to say before I go into this slide, that there are other reports. So if you're interested, particularly in homes, for example, or in businesses, or if you're involved with projects that are connecting renewable energy generation to the network, then I would recommend digging into some of our more detailed reports, where there's plenty of insight in terms of how you can do things better, or where the opportunities lie. But before I wrap up, I just wanted to sort of try and contextualize this project in terms of what it might mean for the future, and perhaps what we can expect as homeowners, and as house occupiers, and also potentially as businesses or organizations that work with businesses to manage their environmental sustainability. Just focusing first of all on homes, what I think the LEM, the Local Energy Market program, signifies, and what I think it's part of, is a transition towards a much smarter home with smarter appliances, including the ability to control your heating systems in a much cleverer way, and of course things like white goods, so your ability to make small changes to the amount of power or the timing of when the different pieces of equipment in your home operate and at what power rating they operate. And combined all together, that can make a really big impact on the way we manage our network and the way we balance generation and demand. Obviously, we can also all see the growth in electric vehicles happening, and we're just starting to see that the ability of vehicles to interact with the grid in a cleverer way emerging as well. what we call that vehicle to grid, which means rather than just drawing power from the grid, vehicles can also start to push power back into the grid. And ultimately that creates a source of flexibility that would be really helpful as electric vehicles grow. So rather than seeing that demand for electricity as another challenge, ultimately electric vehicles offer us a tool that we can use to help manage our electricity system in a cleverer way. And I see that the white goods, the heating systems, the power systems, and the electric vehicles will start to become collected together and managed as full home hubs, ultimately using software and data for all of those activities to be coordinated to really maximize the ability of the home, or maximize the efficiency of the home for bill payers, and also provide a means of supporting the decarbonisation of the grid. I think that will be achieved in part by energy suppliers moving away from charging and supplying by unit per kilowatt hour to providing more of a service to homes, including services that may involve funding equipment like batteries or heat pumps or solar panels, and increasingly new services to homes to help households provide that service to the grid. And as I said at the beginning, there's an opportunity here for people that are really interested to get involved and perhaps control the way their homes work. But the majority of us will want to see ultimately our bills as low as possible, our carbon footprint as low as possible, and someone doing the legwork to help the system work. And I think that's something that we'll see more and more of going forward. And some of you may already be aware of companies like Ecotricity that offer tariffs that support electric vehicles, or a company called Octopus that offers increasingly electricity tariffs with different prices throughout the day and ways of exploiting that. So we'll see that trend continuing to emerge. And we might even see the concept of peer-to-peer trading happen. And that is ultimately where you might see homes trading flexibility or trading energy between each other. I think there's still some time, some development to go on that concept, but ultimately there could be a time where if you had, for example, a battery or solar panels on your roof and you didn't need all of that power at a given time, that you could share that with your neighbor or another member of your community. Lots of changes happening, most of it hopefully leading to greater energy efficiency and reduced bills, and also a lot of it helping to decarbonize our network. And just then, the same lens really, but from a business perspective, I think we'll see some very similar trends happening for businesses. But one of the big changes I think we'll see happening is the concepts I discussed around trading flexibility, trading energy, is something that big businesses already do a little bit of. I think that will increasingly involve smaller businesses as technology and services continue to evolve. So we'll see businesses with greater control and greater involvement, and we'll see smaller businesses playing a role. And that slide I outlined on the Newlyn Ice Factory is a great example of a business that energy is only a cost today, but increasingly might become an opportunity going forward. And with that will become, I talked about the local energy market being a trial of these flexibility services to help manage the grid. I see that as something that will continue to grow and continue to be an opportunity for businesses. And things like electric vehicle fleets will add to that opportunity. So the opportunity to trade and decarbonize our energy will be something that I think will continue to grow and will become a much broader opportunity for different types of businesses. And of course, we might see that concept of peer-to-peer trading happening in the business world as well as the domestic world. And one of the use cases we developed for the local energy market was the idea of connecting businesses with generators to create a flexibility peer-to-peer market. Now, we didn't focus on that in detail because the regulations today don't make that easy, but we think there'll come a time in the future when for example, you could, if a wind turbine was looking to generate power, but the network was struggling to accommodate that power, then perhaps the wind turbine could connect with a local business, and the local business could adjust its demand for energy, creating ultimately demand for that power and creating a win-win for the generator and for the local business. So I see that as a concept that might emerge in the industry in the next few years. And finally, I think we might see the concept of microgrids starting to emerge for medium and larger sites. And that's really around connecting up all the assets, the generation assets, the demand assets on a site, on a business site, and managing that on site such that you can provide a service to the network, or you can make sure that site is managed in an efficient way as possible. And I certainly see that is becoming an interesting opportunity for businesses going forward. So I think that is really everything from me in terms of a snapshot of what the Cornwall Local Energy Market project was, how that relates to our decarbonisation agenda, and some insight in how that works practically for businesses and for homes. And maybe it gives you a bit more understanding about the technical challenges around balancing generation with demand going forward. I certainly think that these concepts that I've quite hurriedly run through and outlined to you will become increasingly part of the general conversation when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to business operations, when it comes to planning and building new businesses and new housing estates. So hopefully this is something that will be interesting to you all, and if you've got any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Yeah, so as Dan said, please do ask questions. Pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom page. And whilst you're thinking of your questions, I'll start by asking questions. So I've written some down. The first was, as a normal person, a normal homeowner, it's impressive that you've managed to get so many homeowners that are already engaging with this, but how do you overcome the problem of, normal people don't really understand this and might need quite a lot of convincing that they want to, spend, well, I suppose spend time, but also take the risk. I think anything that's not following the norm is perceived as taking a risk. No one's ever sure if they really are going to save money, or if they really are going to make a difference, or if it is going to be the right thing for them. So how is that tackled?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in Cornwall, and those people that know Cornwall might be aware that there's, and as is the case in other areas, there's quite a high consciousness of the sustainability agenda in Cornwall. And we've got, for example, quite an active community energy network down here, and a lot of people that don't necessarily work in energy interested in sustainability and energy. So it was dead easy for us to really attract interest in the trial. A lot of people, were already thinking along the lines of this kind of innovation anyway. So we didn't find it hard, obviously, because I think Cornwall has a high degree of people interested in finding out more about this sort of thing. But clearly, if we're going to scale this up, if it to become the norm, and we're going to get the majority of homes operating in this way and adopting low carbon energy technologies, then it's got to be easy, and it's got to be cost effective, and the risk of that investment, that time, has to be taken away from the household. And I think that's really why we wanted, I talked about the aggregator and lumping together the batteries to trade them. I think we were mindful of that fact when we designed the trials. Ultimately, we need to make sure that the majority of people are just busy with their day jobs and want to ultimately save money if they can and do the right thing. And that's why we embraced the aggregator model for our trials. Ultimately, the householders didn't need to do anything. There was software behind the scenes that worked out, ultimately told their their batteries and their solar panels to save them as much energy as possible in the first instance, and then trade what was left of it with the network. So we've designed the technology so it's easy. And then the other question is really financially, you know, can we de-risk the financial side for households? And I think that is where I talked about suppliers and other companies, energy service companies, funding some of these systems. And I think there's ways in which that can be done, and that ways in which that's starting to emerge already, such that households can buy into this equipment without having to ultimately bear the initial capital outlay and bear the risk of having to effectively trade the flexibility. So I think highly automated, keep it simple, and also there are ways of, for those that want it, funding these systems externally.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question from somebody who's dialed in. It's quite a long one, so bear with me. It says, that's extraordinary, further reaching than I'd realized we were at. Amazing. Can I ask, does it, through dispersing risk, oddly feel also that it may be raising a new risk in these days of opaque financial arrangement? So no aspersions, obviously, it says. Just wonder how the equalities within the model are secured, for example, aggregators, influencers, etc.
So that's a long question with
yes.
a long answer. One we could probably spend a good hour debating. But I think, first of all, it's worth acknowledging that with these sorts of changes, there's definitely a risk that, or there are a set of new risks that need to be carefully explored. And a lot of them are consumer related. So a lot of them go back to households. For example, you know, vulnerable. How do you make sure vulnerable people aren't exploited? How do you make sure that the distribution of value is fair, and so on? And then at a slightly higher level, how do you make sure that the models adopted, I talked about the aggregator, ultimately don't strip value away from the community? So I'm not suggesting that they conceived to do that, but I think that's something that is a valid issue to explore. So for the purposes of our trials, we focused more on demonstrating the proof of concept. And I think there's further work to be done to ensure that some of the risks are ironed out. But I note that there are already actions happening and debates happening around how you ensure consumer protection is managed carefully as we progress towards smart energy systems, and how we make sure that vulnerable individuals aren't harmed, or their positions aren't made worse by you know, having to adopt new technologies, having to adopt new arrangements, potentially new contracts, new agreements that are potentially more opaque. But I think it's incumbent upon the energy industry to make sure that, and energy the regulator to make sure that all of those are as transparent as can be made and as simple as can be made. And ultimately, the key agenda here is a common one, that we achieve the decarbonisation that we're trying to achieve as a wider society.
That was a long answer. You went wrong. Next question says, it looks like it was a great success. How big should the local energy markets be? That it depends a lot on the transmission infrastructure.
So I didn't go into the market design and the software architecture in detail, but we were quite careful that when we built it so that it could scale, because I think a solution like this is really going to be valuable if it can achieve high levels of liquidity, or in other words, lots of businesses and homes providing services. One that drives best value for the wider energy system and spreads the value amongst lots of different people and businesses. And two, that gives the network lots of tools to play tunes with that balancing issue that ultimately sits at the heart of this exercise. So in terms of the tool, we've built it so it can go as big as it needs to go. And when I say big, I mean in terms of encouraging liquidity and going into new geographies beyond Cornwall. Potentially it's a piece of software that could be adopted across the whole of the country and indeed Europe and other locations. How big does it need to go in terms of the infrastructure? I think that the beauty of the platform is that it helps us minimize the need for more infrastructure. So I think that's the key concept here. Rather than invest in more transformers, in more cables, and in more substations to increase the capability of the network, this platform gives us more tools to manage the network in a more efficient way. So the more we use the platform, both in Cornwall and beyond, the greater efficiency we can drive from the infrastructure that we already have, and obviously the cost we can avoid that we would otherwise have to put into that infrastructure to accommodate our growth in renewables that we need to decarbonize.
Thank you very much. The next question is for people who live in premises that can't have a heat pump, for example, people that live in flats, the only future eco option is having metered heat brought in from a system such as a combined power and heat plant, which take fossil fuels. Is there another solution being designed for the future?
So I think we're seeing lots of innovation happening in the heating space, and just dialing into some of the policy and announcements from government over the last 12 months, you're seeing that the government, I think, recognises that is a key area of focus for decarbonisation. And of course, there are the risks of potential inequality there as well that we need to work through. I think those technologies are evolving. I'm aware of electricity, increasing focus on electric heating, both communal and individual. And of course, with that solution, you have the ability to optimize and manage that system and provide services to the network, such as I've outlined just now. And of course, I know that there's a pathway to ensure that the communal heating systems that the question refers to move away from carbon intensive fuels towards low carbon fuels. So for example, you could see systems coming forward with communal heat pumps. You might see other technologies based on fuels like biomass emerging more that can decarbonize in a communal way rather than on an individual basis.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How often did the bids occur? So if you were buying or selling, how far ahead could you commit? And was the energy transfer fixed, or could it vary in real time?
That's a good question. So this is about market rules, really. So this goes under the kind of lifting the lid of the eBay, if you like. So what can you sell onto the platform? So for those that are not like Joe, energy geeks, who've been following this in this transition in more detail, you'll know that already there is a transition happening, and the local energy market is one of the tools that's being explored to help that happen. And the distribution network operators, such as Western Power in Cornwall, are being encouraged to try and buy flexibility. And at the moment, that's happening over the very long term, and it's only happening really with businesses that can forecast months ahead and lock in a price for a service over the longer term. What the LEM does is introduces a lot more variability in those products, because ultimately that model is not an optimal model and will not deliver value to the whole system over the long term. I think that product will evolve further. The LEM allows a business ultimately to offer a service long term and also short term, and it runs a series of auctions. It runs an auction months ahead of time, ultimately allowing the network to reserve capacity that it might need. It then offers a series of auctions that run closer and closer to time, including an intraday auction, which is basically a capacity auction, which allows the networks to buy flexibility that it knows it needs either a couple of hours ahead or within the same day. So and one of the reasons why that's important is because if you look at electric vehicles, at the moment it's very difficult for somebody who has an electric vehicle, or even an aggregator that has access to a lot of electric vehicles, to forecast many months ahead what that electric vehicle is going to be doing at 7 o'clock on Saturday night. But on Saturday morning, or even Friday evening, it might be able to clarify that. So these short-term products within a market like the LEM, I think, are going to become really valuable to technologies like electric vehicles, to ensure that they can provide a dynamic, close-to-time service. So as a seller, you can get involved in a range of different products, long-term and short-term, including intraday on the LEM.
Okay, thank you. We have a very long question now. It might be someone that just needs to talk to you directly by the wording of it, but I'll read it out and you can start a dialogue. So it says, "Hi Dan, I'm an energy consultant based in Penzance. I've been working with schools, businesses and town councils in the area to procure greener electric energy supply. So Ecotricity, Good Energy and Haven are promoting that they are 100% renewable and are usually the top 3 when I'm searching the market for greener suppliers on their behalf. The appetite in Cornwall is to move away from suppliers who use nuclear and purchase REGOs. That might mean something to you too. I'm getting inundated at this time with SMEs wanting to switch suppliers to minimise their carbon footprint and to be seen as more green. In regard to Centrica and British Gas, am I and their clients missing a trick here, or is there some more information you could provide to reinforce your capabilities, commitment and future thinking? I'm getting inundated at this time with SMEs wanting to switch suppliers to minimise their carbon footprint." Andrew. So that's Andrew Moss Robinson. You might need to just talk to each other.
So yeah, it'd be great to have a detailed chat with Andrew in due course. I mean, the short answer to that question is probably yes. I mean, it's a little bit too short, really, to answer that question. I agree that Centrica and others should continue to clarify the offer around decarbonisation. The local energy market is one area of innovation that helps with that. And there are other businesses in the sector doing great things that will really help to drive that forward. And I do think that's happening. I'm very conscious of the innovations that Centrica's doing, and bringing both technology platforms and data together with low carbon generation to create those kind of offers that I think I agree that the businesses are, and indeed homes are, looking for. There's a lot more to be done, clearly, but there's lots of exciting things happening in the sector, and I really agree with Andrew with the premise ultimately that more needs to be done, and I do think that will come forward. But yeah, it'd be great to have a more detailed conversation with Andrew about some of that, and hopefully the local energy market program is one of the innovations that we'll see coming forward that give businesses much more clarity and control over their energy that they produce, use, and obviously they buy from the system.
Okay, Andrew, I think you might be able to send in the chat box. You might be able to send a message just to the participants. I'm sorry, the presenters. I mean the presenters. So if you see if it works, and if you wanted to share your email address with Dan, then yeah, try the chat box, and I think you can select who you're chatting with. Okay. Next question. Would you foresee local energy markets working better with a larger number of small-scale generation sites, or fewer but higher capacity generators, or should it work equally well in either scenario?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it's important to recognise where we are today. We've demonstrated that that it can work with large and small sites. The aspiration behind the design was to break down barriers for more smaller businesses and for homes to get involved. That was one of our kind of key objectives with the technology, because clearly we think that the energy system will benefit from unlocking as much flexibility as we can, which means bringing smaller businesses to the table to enable them to to provide that service if they have it, and the same with homes as well as larger businesses. So I lean towards an optimal system has more as a range of sites and more of them. That's liquidity. However, I note that as things start, as products are being built, it's a lot easier to start with some larger capacity sites. So we might see that products like the LEM come forward, and the initial focus is on working with maybe large businesses, for example, or a big aggregated block of homes with a big supply behind that. But the intent absolutely is to create tools and solutions that as many different businesses and homes can use in an as easy as possible in the future, because clearly liquidity is going to be key. And it's not just a number, it's also liquidity across the network. So the more flexibility we have spread across our network, the more tools the network has to balance generation with demand.
Okay. And then we don't have any other questions at the moment from the people that have dialed in, but I do have another question myself. How long do you think it will take before this does become normal, just trading local energy markets?
I think it will. I think we'll see it increasingly become part of the norm of the next couple of years. I think the key kind of watershed moment is 2023. And the reason why I state that is down to the way the distribution network operation is kind of governed and run in the UK. 2023 marks the beginning of another block of regulated and licensed funding arrangements. And so I think that will be a moment where we see a real commitment to opening up these kind of markets and a kind of step change in their use. But we're already seeing them being built, being trialed. And even after that date, I think there's scope for them to continue to evolve, change shape, offer new value as we go forward, much in the way that, if you like, perhaps the analogy of eBay or Amazon, whereby those platforms started with a concept and have continued to offer new value to the parties that trade on them. I just one example of where perhaps a liquid flexibility market at the local level might add value is to the EV electric vehicle kind of sales side. You know, if a given location has high value for flexibility, as demonstrated by the market, that could be integrated into an offer from an electric vehicle seller ultimately, or a franchise business that sells electric vehicles. So you could start to package things like electric vehicles with opportunities for revenue that are specific to local geographies. So that at the moment is just a kind of a concept that could become a reality. But if you have these kind of platforms being used increasingly normally and increasingly so, I can see that they will continue to evolve and add new opportunities, new values. I talked about peer-to-peer. That's another opportunity that we might see emerge once we see these platforms become more part of our day-to-day lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then one other question has just come in, very specific question. Can lithium batteries be recycled? And if not, how are they disposed of?
Yeah, so there's clearly some challenges around certain technologies that need to be, not ignored. I think the thing about lithium batteries is that obviously you've got a manufacturing and you've got a disposal challenge that needs to be managed. But what I'm seeing that I think is interesting and exciting is reuse of lithium batteries in the first instance. And I think that's probably where I'd like to focus, kind of my focus in the initial stages. Can we reuse such batteries before we get into a more complex recycling process? And I'm seeing a market start to evolve around perhaps reusing lithium batteries from electric vehicles for other services, bringing them into containerized units to provide trading facilities to provide this flexibility that I just talked about. So I think you can, but I don't think we should shy away from the fact that lithium is a challenge. I think the priority for us here is decarbonisation, because there are solutions that can be found, and one of the initial solutions is to make sure we get the most out of those technologies and extend their lifetime as long as we can before we have to look at recycling.
Thank you. And my final question, sorry, is I'm assuming this isn't happening anywhere else. It's just in Cornwall. That's the only one you're aware of where this type of platform's been trialed.
So yes and no. Yes, because what we built is unique, but it's unique in terms of the capability that we built. It's not the only trial that's looking at the idea of trying to encourage flexibility to help manage the grid. So there are other trials and other products in the UK that are being looked at. And of course, there are other similar products being explored across Europe and some in the States as well. So it's not something that we're doing in isolation. However, but I would say that the capability and technology that we've built is unique, and I think actually on the whole it's certainly out at the forefront in terms of the capability that it offers. I talked about the ability to do multiple products, long-term reserve, intraday capacity, the ability to do it as an automated market rather than as a kind of bilateral set of arrangements. So I think capability-wise, the LEM is right out the front of this transition, but it's not the only project that's starting to look at the challenge of how do we unlock flexibility at the local level.
Thank you. Right, well, we have no more questions. And so I think that is the end. So unless you have any closing remarks, any words of wisdom, any inspirational comments?
Only is really to say thank you to everybody for listening, and thanks for the questions. Every time I do speak about this technology, I always worry that, I spend my day job looking at this, and I've definitely been accused of being an energy geek at times. And I'm always not sure what other people think, do they really care? Are they really interested? But every time I do talk about this subject, I'm always kind of reassured by the questions that people do care. People care generally about decarbonisation and some of the kind of opportunities and challenges that we face in trying to achieve that. So yeah, really energizing and inspiring to hear the questions and hear that people are interested. And I'm not just alone in a geeky world thinking about this on my own.
No, you're not alone. Good. Well, thank you ever so much on behalf of the Southwestern branch and also on behalf of the wider CIWEM community. We really do appreciate the time that you've committed to preparing your presentation and sharing that with us tonight. As I said at the start of this call, we are always on the lookout for interesting presentations of things that you'd like to do, our audience would like to share with us. So do not hesitate to get in touch and we'll help work with you to find suitable dates, find suitable platforms, refine the topics with you and make sure that that we can push these through to share with CIWEM and other interested people. Also, don't forget to carry on looking at the CIWEM website for other events that are up and coming. It's kept fairly up to date. There's the links that Barbara put into the chat box as well, so do have a look at those before you go. And yes, stay safe, please. Obey the rules. And thank you very much again for dialing in. Thank you.